Welcome to For the Record. I'm your host Shane Tutmarc. Today we have Rutherford from Los Colognes. We're going to be talking about the Beatles' Revolver. But before we get into that, make sure to hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments what you think. I'm so glad you chose this record. This is a big one for me as well. And let's just start with your journey with it. How did this record find you?
Well, it was part of my parents' record collection growing up. They didn't have a ton of records. They didn't have, I think it was Beatles, it was Michael Jackson, it was Phil Collins, it was...
I can hear the Phil Collins.
Yeah.
It's coming through.
Oh, yeah. Earth, Wind and Fire, Chicago. But the way that the Beatles records popped off the speakers was just something about it. I mean, the melodies, the harmonies, the vocal timbres, the strange mixes where you could kind of hear, Paul's bass and
right.
And
like
Ringo's drums on the left,
yeah,
and you could kind of enter into that world, and you could go, because we had the speakers set up sort of randomly in the living room.
Yeah.
And
so how old were you when you kind of first thought of, when it first hit you, I guess? Like
middle school for sure is right around the time I got a guitar. Just immediately started. The Beatles are perfect for learning guitar because there's so many great just chords, and you're just learning to strum through the chords. And even if there's reverse guitars and string sections and crazy drum fills going on, there's always just this rooting in these basic but like super catchy, super wonderful melodies that have just they're just a great chord band to learn to play guitar. So that's definitely the first sort of understanding. And then as I got older, in high school and in college, and sort of expanding my mind and learning about the history of things, obviously took on whole other layers of meaning.
Right.
So
they're a band that you can keep going back to in different phases.
Yeah.
Every
couple of years I kind of come back to their whole catalog, especially Revolver, and sometimes it tears, because it's just so profound. I just don't think it'll ever be topped.
Now, did discovering the Beatles and learning their songs, did that influence your taste on other artists that you were listening to at the time? Or
sure. I mean, you start with the Beatles, you start hearing it in everything, and it's a sort of beacon by which all things must be judged. Mm-hmm. So yeah, definitely.
I remember noticing when the Weezer Blue album came out, they have that one song that has the same riff as, She Said at the beginning of Surf Wax America. I remember finding these parallels.
Oh yeah, totally. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you can't unsee it, you can't unhear it, and I almost don't. I can't listen to the Beatles all the time because it will.
Right.
It's depressing because
you're like, what's the point?
You're never gonna make anything that good. Yeah. So it's like every couple of years you just kind of go back to the well, go back to the mountain, go back to Mecca, and just sort of in awe of what they did in such a short amount of time. I think Revolver is like the hinge point of everything.
And how has that view changed now that you've had 10 years or more of making records of your own versus being like the 12-year-old kid learning guitar chords?
Right. Yeah. Well, at that age you understand the significance of the album less, and you're just hearing the sounds coming off the speakers. But as you get older and you try to make records, you say, well, Jesus, this is really hard. How do you have something that has a through line? How do you reference the age underneath? How do you subtly get at kind of more structural, seismic, tectonic plates that are happening in society at large? And
the zeitgeist of the moment. And the timeless, maybe.
So Revolver he speaks to the time, but also is incredibly timeless.
Do you have a favorite song on the record, or?
Well, I mean, it's sort of the perfect Beatles record that every member's identity comes out. But I mean, you can't talk about Revolver without talking about Tomorrow Never Knows,
right?
Which I'll straight rip off those kind of sonic textures any day of the week and immediately think it's cool.
Yeah.
It's just
between that drum beat and the sort of loops and samples, and it still feels so fresh. Yeah,
and it just seems like the whole album is sort of leading up to the statement of that song, even if it was John just mucking about with the Tibetan Book of the Dead, but it's like
Right.
You talk, there's just an unrest in the album, inability to understand mortality, inability to get out of bed and find meaning, looking for answers in pot, looking for answers in society at large, seeing, financial pressures and relationship issues, and that's
right.
And you just have this great big om at the end, and it's just this kind of letting go, and it was a perfect moment in time because Western culture was unruly, and there was a lot of unrest, and
similar to today.
Sure.
In a lot of ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think about that a lot. It's like, how do you make a record that addresses the sign of the times, the age, the zeitgeist, the feeling, without being overly specific or overly political, but like, how do you reach to the existential being in the listener? And that's what that record does for me, without a doubt.
Yeah. So do you have a favorite Beatle? Are you more of a John guy, Paul guy? There's a lot of George on this record.
Yeah. A lot of George, like, sort of figuring out his relationship with Eastern mysticism and what he means to it all. I don't think I have a favorite Beatle because I just think they were just like, it was the band.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The older I get, I was such a John guy as a kid, but the older I get, you realize that they all needed each other.
Yeah.
And they all, improved each other.
Yeah. I think the woke thing to say is that George is the coolest.
Right.
I think the indie thing to say is that John is the coolest. I think the reactionary thing to say is that, look at the guitar solo on Taxman, that was Paul. Paul was musically a driving force in the band, and they wouldn't have been that band without his bass. But Ringo is a hell of a. Ringo's the fills. No one plays fills like Ringo. So it's just a shining light of and for that record to have a through line, which it totally does, even though there's shit as disparate as Yellow Submarine is to Tomorrow Never Knows.
Right. Or Eleanor Rigby.
Yeah. I don't know how they did it.
Yeah, I feel like, if a band were to do something that all over the place these days, I don't know how many bands could pull that off.
Not a lot. Not a lot, You
just don't even hear people hardly attempting that anymore. It's it's interesting.
Yeah. Well, because a lot of bands haven't had 10,000 hours playing in German clubs like the Beatles.
Right. Yeah.
It was a lot of bands in town in Nashville, or people that have, put in thousands of hours down on Broadway doing covers.
Mm-hmm.
Interestingly, I find that doesn't always translate into innovative and cool records.
Right. So they were on a different path than.
Well, they did the covers. They learned the Elvis. They learned a Little Richard. But somehow they started figuring out their own voice in it, and Revolver's just the perfect album for that. And so every time I go to make a record, we go to make a record. How do you even get one little percentage of that?
And so, can you pinpoint certain songs of yours that you feel like you gleaned something from Revolver?
Well, in the past 15 years, I've made tons of records. In a lot of, flirted with a lot of different styles. So the most recent Los Colognes record, The Wave, is definitely less like trying to be a Beatles record.
Mm-hmm.
But
I was listening for little clues today.
Right.
And, I hear maybe the intro to Flying Apart, maybe having a little Tomorrow Never Knows in there.
Yeah. And the last track, Can You Remember, the intro to that is very much like a Beatles-y Revolver type thing. And the last track on The Wave, Can You Remember, sort of sums up the entire experience, philosophically, lyrically, emotionally, leading up to it. And I think that's one thing that Revolver does really well with the Tomorrow Never Knows ending. Kind of sums up the unrest, like we talked about. And
that's something that I had never looked at the song that way, but that makes a lot of sense. It's like all these different things that they're expressing sort of get answered in a certain way, like the Tomorrow Never Knows, or
right. Whether they even believe it or not,
right?
But it is. It's
a cool way to look at it.
Yeah, and I think
because I've actually heard, trivia that they started the record with Tomorrow Never Knows. That was one of the first things they worked on, which is
happy accident.
Yeah, who knows? Yeah,
and that's the. Did they intentionally? The song order and it's. but it just works.
Yeah, yeah.
You know.
So is this a record you see yourself continually going back to? Do you see this journey continuing for years to come?
I mean, I think that I'll always come back to the Beatles, and in particular Revolver, because I mean, just the guitar tones, just a sort of overdriven, jangly, mid-rangey thing, and the guitar harmonies, and the irreverent reversed solos, and just the bounce of the rhythm section, but then just the ability to go tender for no one. Your day breaks, your mind aches, just that right there, that's just a songwriting archetype, like that chord, that flat 7, whatever chord it is there. It's just amazing.
Just that little bit of sophistication over like a sort of simple...
They were so good at that. And so I'm always trying to... There's always a Beatles check and balance in the back of my mind. All the time, you know. There's always like Little John and George in the background. The melody needs to be stronger there, you know. Like, It's just.
I used to have a Beatles poster in my piano room, and it always felt like they were sort of judging me
I
working on songs.
Totally. We probably had the same poster. So I think earlier in the day of making records, we would definitely sort of rip more directly off.
And now it's maybe more of a philosophical sort of...
philosophical, just there's like subtle little ways in which you want to reference that, not just to like secretly reference it, but just because it's a fundamental...
It's a language
of good, of like objectively valuable musicality.